We've talked quite a lot about different prominent women characters in the story of Jesus. I'm wondering, because there's such prominent women figures, how does this play out in the early church?
So I think you can see several different things happening. So in the Acts of the Apostles, which you can kind of see as a second volume to the Gospel of Luke, you do see women present, and they don't have big roles, but they're mentioned. So we do know that there's a woman named Lydia. We do know that there's a woman named Priscilla, and she's married to a man named Aquila. And she becomes important also in the Pauline tradition. So Paul, in writing his letters, and I'm talking about the undisputed letters that we consider written by him and not pseudonymous, will mention Priscilla or Prisca, and oftentimes her name comes first. And so that's interesting because usually you would mention the man first. And he talks about her as a co-worker and someone who is faithful, also taking part of the mission that he's undertaken to go to the Gentiles and spread the word, the gospel to them. So she has a prominent role in building those communities. You also have a very intriguing greeting in Romans chapter 16. He writes this long letter to the Romans talking about theology, talking about all sorts of big theological notions that are debated ad nauseum today about righteousness and salvation, etc. But in chapter 16, he has a list of greetings. And if you look at who's mentioned, there are many women mentioned, mothers, a widow, and then there's one woman named Junia who is mentioned. And she's a very intriguing figure because in chapter 16, verse 7, he says to greet Andronicus and Junia. We take it for granted that they're married. And he calls them prominent among the apostles. And so there has been a lot of debate about this. And sometime in let's say in the last 200 years especially, but maybe a little earlier than that, her name has changed to Junius, so that it is now masculine, or it's been posited that it's a shortening of a masculine name, Junianus. Now, there are no attestations of a male name, Junius or Junianus. It's just posited that it has to be a male name because it's an apostle, right? And so that name, Junia, is attested, though, like over 200 times in Rome in inscriptions at the time. So obviously, the easiest way to answer this is indeed a woman, and she's a female apostle. There have been other arguments to say she's not prominent among the apostles. She's well known to the apostles, so that she is not actually an apostle. So there's all sorts of grammatical arguments that try to twist this so that she's not an apostle. But all signs point to that she is an apostle before Paul. He says, who are in Christ before me, and fellow prisoners, and so that she was part of the early church and well known. And she's praised actually by other church writers, early church writers like Chrysostom, who says how wonderful she must have been if she was an apostle and also well known. So all evidence points to a female apostle, despite later debates to the contrary. But things start to change when we get to the pastoral epistles. So these are letters that are disputed. So most scholars agree that these were not written by Paul, but written later, maybe from Pauline communities, in Paul's name, in Paul's style. And then we start getting passages like in Timothy, where we hear that women are not supposed to have leadership roles, or that they're not to speak. There's also a variant in 1 Corinthians that most people agree that this is not Paul writing, but maybe a later interpolation. So did something change is the question, right? Were women involved? And then at some point, this was seen as disruptive, against convention, looked down upon by outside society, who knows? But then suddenly in the pastoral epistles, we have women who are saved through childbirth, or women who are lesser, or there are the grantings of church positions. So for example, if you're going to choose a bishop or you're going to choose a presbyter, he has to keep good control of his household, and his children must be well behaved, married only to one, has been married only to one wife, etc. Right? So it's assumed that it's going to be male and always defined in that way.
It's so interesting because it's almost like what the kind of stories that you find in the Synoptic Gospels, right, that are upending, these like patriarchal structures actually seem to be sort of like reified in the early church,
Yeah.
or in even like the later, the later developments. I wonder, I mean, I guess it's just like curiosity, how, different contemporary Christian communities deal with, these different and conflicting pieces of information that they get from the New Testament and from sort of like the early church and sort of that line of textual tradition.
Yeah.
What do they do with that?
The debate over Junia is one such example, right? What are you going to do with her? So you have those who would say, look, in the pastorals, Paul, because usually those groups believe that this is actually Paul writing, that Paul says that women can't have these particular positions. It's assumed, right? They can maybe be deacons or co-workers. They cannot be elders in the church, right? So they will follow that despite having the evidence of Junia and apostle. It's only in the pastorals that Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach. And so you'll find certain more conservative institutions who don't allow women to teach, or at least have power or teaching power over men. Right? So they can teach children Sunday school, but they cannot have leadership in a church position over others, adults. And so that's one way to do that. The other side would be to say, look, there are these pieces of evidence for people like Junia and people like Prisca, and it's apparent that women are participating in church worship. In the Corinthian letters, women are obviously prophesying, praying in the congregation, because Paul's addressing that. So it's obviously happening. So how can he both say this and that, right? And so...
What do we make of that?
Yeah, so, I mean, one is to say this is undisputed Paul writing, and it is disputed Paul, pseudonymous Paul, writing later in the pastorals. And so then which one would you choose, right? They're both canonical. So in some way, it's I think the ethics of that has to come from that community, right? It's not going to come from the text. The text is going to have two completely different takes on what kind of role women can have or what evidence there is. And also in Galatians, in chapter 4, Paul says, there is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male and female. So, right. So you could take this as a very radical understanding. And Paul, of course, is thinking about like imminent eschatology, apocalypse. So these things do not matter. Of course, we're in a different context in which that's been delayed a couple thousand years. So how are you going to deal with that? But it seems like certain people took him at his word. There is no more. So we don't need to observe these conventions. You can find perhaps another strand of that understanding in something like the story of Thecla, when she's like, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to wear a man's cloak. I'm going to cut my hair and look like a man. There is no more male and female. Like, she doesn't say that, but I think it is a later understanding of what Paul's saying in Galatians 4.